I didn't do it. Hey, buddy.
It's okay. Let's leave it for today. Hey, man. How are you doing? It's a guerrilla podcasting from various different locations today.
We're broadcasting live from California today over here on this side of the pond. Yeah, how are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. I'm determined to lose weight. The typical thing of a middle-aged man who spends a lot of time in front of the computer. I put on weight, and lockdown wasn't helpful. So yeah, I've just been tracking my calories, feeling a bit hungry, but I seem to be losing some weight, so it's worthwhile. So yeah, it's all good.
Hopefully you won't
Personal
be
wins.
hangry during the conversation.
Not
Yeah.
really. No, I don't get hangry so much as just kind of really hungry for bad things. Really, my wife does hangry. I mean, it's definitely one of those things that you've got to, keep an eye on. People vary. That's one of those dividers of types of people. You've had to do an A/B division of the population. People who get hangry, people who just mainly get hungry. There you go.
This
Which
is
is
sad.
not today's topic
Depressed.
at all. Today's topic has nothing to do with that, which is marketing traps in fragmented industries. So from Michael Porter's wonderful work. Very looking forward to this. This looks
Yeah.
like a juicy topic to me. So to tease up what we're talking about today for the watchers.
Porter's famous classic book on competitive strategy outlines many contexts and situations in which we find ourselves in as e-commerce operators. And so we'll dive into that today and talk specifically about traps in fragmented industries. And I think that'll serve many of our listeners well. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, even identifying something as a fragmented industry as a lens or a way of thinking,
Mhm.
even reading through the outline that you've made for today's podcast, I'm like, whoa, this is deep. This applies very greatly
Mhm.
to a lot of my clients' work. So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely highly important stuff to listen to, I think.
Yeah, absolutely right. Because many of us, when we start out, really don't understand the environment in which we're operating, even amongst competitors. We just don't know what we don't know. We don't know who's out there and who we're going to be competing against. And
Mm,
then we might see who's on Amazon if that's where we start. And we're like, okay, I understand the sellers on Amazon. But of course, that's just one channel in an industry or niche and
yeah,
one
of
set
course.
of players. And it really doesn't present you with a holistic view. And so, yeah, I mean, so that's sort of the context by which I think this is very fascinating for literally every e-commerce seller. This is applicable and important to think through. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
great. Well, look, let's shall we get
Well,
started? I guess we ought to invite watchers as usual to put any comments or questions in. That would certainly be great
absolutely.
if we can weave those in if they fit in. Oh, could I just request their comments or questions relevant to the topic at hand? Occasionally, people putting random requests like, "Should I be
Right.
buying X product on retail arbitrage?" I'm like, "Well, that's not really a strategy question, so let's avoid those, folks."
Great. All right. You ready for me to kick this thing off?
I am. Yeah, you're in charge of the cameras, so up to you to
Okay.
move those
Yeah.
around. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. All right. Sorry. I'm just making sure I've got my tech set up here properly. Okay. Let's do this. Yeah. Here we go. Harvard Business School Harvard Business School professor Michael Porter wrote an incredibly important book pre-internet that speaks to many e-commerce sellers' situations. And in this series of podcasts, we're going to dive into the book all about strategy. And we want to break it down into its component parts. The book title is Competitive Strategy by, again, Michael Porter, Harvard Business School professor. We're going to pull some excerpts from it, some frameworks and ideas, and talk about them in this episode. Michael, are you ready to jump into this important conversation about e-commerce marketing traps in fragmented industries?
Yes, definitely sounds very interesting. Well, certainly my experience of e-commerce is that yeah, fragmented is a good way to describe a lot of markets. There's nobody who's the obvious leader. Things come and go. Fragmented is the least of it, really. Somewhat chaotic is not the right word, but yeah, fragmented feels instinctively right. So Michael Porter's famous in my mind for the book, The Five Forces of Strategy, or for the concept of the Five Forces of Strategy, which I confess I haven't read, which is kind of amazing because I love strategy books. Is this a subset of that, or is it not really related directly to that concept?
Honestly, I think we're both a little in the dark on who he is and what his work is in totality. I don't know the answer to that question. All I know is I stumbled into this fantastic content. I was like, okay, I've never seen this before. It was published, I think, before, honestly, 1980 is before I was into business. I mean, it's when I was a kid. And but now we've got this rich resource from him as he's outlined these market dynamics that I think we can reapply. So I don't know if it's a subset, but nonetheless, we're going to plow through it and look at how he outlines the ideas related to fragmented markets today. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, so just outline for us what are we talking about today? What's the sort of general topic? So, fragmented markets. What does that even mean, and how does that apply to e-commerce in the broadest possible way?
Yeah. Part of his book, the strategy book, he did this whole conversation about the market dynamics. And so, chapter after chapter, he lays out the different scenarios in which markets can be created or the dynamics within them. And so, he kind of differentiates between a fragmented market, an emerging market or emerging industry, industries in transition from growth phases to maturity phases where there might be consolidation, and then declining industries, and then finding actually global industries as well. All of these different descriptors and types of dynamics have different tactical strategies that therefore we need to think about and understand. The e-commerce age in the last few years, especially fueled by COVID's rapid transition to e-commerce purchasing, has really created a dynamic in which many of us find ourselves competing in new ways and selling at higher levels and needing to understand what happens in these types of big market forces and dynamics contexts and how does it apply to our business. So that's a little bit of the rationale behind what he's trying to do as he breaks down the different markets that you might find yourself in as you're a seller. In this conversation, I thought what we might do is pick apart this idea of the fragmented market, because I think it's probably the most common for us as kind of entry level, entrepreneurial level e-commerce sellers, as differentiated from, the Nordstroms or, Costco's of the world that are selling online. That's just not who we speak to as a podcast and not who's in our community. So I think this fragmented market framework is really most applicable to, kind of who we are as a community.
That makes sense, and I think that experience that all of us have in everyday e-commerce selling would sort of backs that up. That sort of fragmentation,
Mhm.
as you say, sort of lots of new entrants during the pandemic, kind of new entrants on the consumer side, which is great. Some like my mum made her first Amazon purchase under pandemic conditions ever, and she's now mid-70s, so she's probably typical of her generation, maybe something of a laggard with technology. But on the other
Yeah.
hand, new entrants from the high street guys finally switching over to e-commerce because they
Mhm.
had to. So yeah, you're right. That's probably been part of the dynamics that's led to this feeling of fragmentation. Okay, so what are these? We're going to look at reasons for fragmentation, right? 12 reasons, I believe. So
Yeah.
what's the first reason for that?
Yeah, let's rattle through this list of 12 and then we can cherry pick out the things that catch our attention or the things that we like and want to go deeper on, since it's a pretty substantial list. But basically, this is his list of why industries get fragmented and fractured up and broken into a million little sellers. And there's so much here that's relevant to the e-commerce age. So let me just mention the 12 straight through, and then we'll come back and talk about any of them. So the first reason is low overall entry barriers to entry. And the second one is an absence of economies of scale or the benefits of an experience curve. The third one is high transportation costs, which COVID has fueled with incredible pain. The fourth one is high inventory costs or erratic sales. The fifth one is no advantage of size when dealing with buyers or suppliers. So you really have no economies of scale in terms of the cost of goods. The sixth one is diseconomies of scale in some respects. That means that the bigger you get, the more expensive things become for you. We've never talked about that, which is a very interesting idea for e-commerce sellers. The seventh thing is diverse market needs. In other words, when buyers are willing to pay a premium for special varieties or the they want customization, those types of things, um, and sellers service them, with those needs. The eighth thing is high product differentiation. So there's a large degree of small changes or little tweaks. This is really private label in mass. The ninth is exit barriers, meaning it's hard for people to exit an industry. The 10th is local regulations. The 11th is government prohibition, or concentration, almost like a duopoly, or where the government creates barriers. And then the 12th thing is newness. Whenever there's tons of newness in an industry, it becomes fragmented as new people bring new things to the party. So that's a list of 12 reasons why industries get fragmented in the first place. And I think almost every one of them could speak to the situation of e-commerce sellers. What stands out in your mind as you look at that list, Michael?
Yeah, I guess the first thing is just the question of which market you're in, and the whole phrase that springs to mind is the riches are in the niches, which always makes me wince because that's not how you pronounce the word niche, but it's a useful little phrase. In other words, going sub niche, so going for a smaller and smaller market, makes sense. It's kind of taken as a truism, an axiom, universally true for everyone, but actually maybe it's
Mhm,
only true if we are in, and this is why we're sort of getting the bigger picture of what environment we're even in, what kind of environment we're even operating in as e-commerce operators,
mhm,
because that's true for us. It probably wouldn't be true if you're selling crude oil. I mean, crude oil is crude oil. It's a commodity, but people make
mhm.
billions every year from selling it. It's not true if you're selling wheat or sugar, and yet people make billions in those industries. So I guess that phrase probably only applies when we've identified that the industry is fragmented. So I suppose before I'm even plunging into any of those reasons, this sort of makes me reflect on that. And what are your thoughts? This is what springs to mind.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think there's so many of these that we could jump into that are of interest for e-commerce sellers. I think of, for example, the low overall entry barriers to entry, and it's almost one of those truisms that whenever you say to someone in e-commerce, "Hey, this is a bad idea," you should never do this. Someone will prove you wrong by doing it in a new way.
That's
It's
true.
like, oh, never take a product off Alibaba and just try to sell it. Well, unless you're a TikTok influencer, and then you can do it and make millions. It's like, oh, never do drop shipping. That's a horrible business. Well, unless you've got a big niche with a little a big email list and an interesting niche, and it's a high ticket product, and then you make millions. And I think this low barrier to entry thing is certainly something that keeps e-commerce marketplaces fragmented. It's just the nature of how the system has worked. There are so many sellers, and you see that when you go on Etsy, for example, and you look at some type of product. Maybe it's a wine glasses that are etched or something like that, or maybe some kind of special thing that's that you want for your household, and you realize how many people can do that type of thing. So this low barrier to entry idea is fascinating. It really means that you'll always be operating in an environment in which the new upstart can come in and compete against you with their own creative ideas, energy, brand, social media skills. And that to me is fascinating. We've watched that happen in our little corner of the internet for 13 years. And every time a new person comes in with an interesting marketing approach or strategy, we think, oh no, you know? And so I think that one speaks to me sort of because I see it so often. The high transportation cost isn't even worth talking about because everybody in the world is talking about high transportation costs. I don't think we need to cover that. There's no new ground there. Um, but I don't know. That's just one. Anything else on the list that catches your eye? I'll mention another one if you want to go
Yeah,
back and forth.
sure. I ought to mention, by the way, to everyone who's listening or watching, that we are going to do a podcast probably separately because there's a lot here to unpick on common approaches to how we overcome fragmentation. So as you were
Mhm,
saying, we're going to be focusing on the problems today. I guess don't worry, we will come up with solutions. But yeah, the low barrier to entry thing is a problem for established sellers, and established could mean like you've been selling for 2 years, and then
mm,
you've just about gone full time, and then somebody else comes in. Um, what else strikes me? High transportation costs, the only thing I would say to that, I mean, everyone talks about it all the time, is I don't think they've seen anything yet. I think
Mm.
that sadly, that's going to become huge as opposed to merely painful. That's all I would say on that. And you know what that does with fragmentation. I don't know. What's your view of how that applies if transport costs triple, for example? What does that
Well,
do to the
let's
fragmentation?
let's GTO that out, game theory optimize that out. So let's say that there are 100 sellers in one specific sub niche little corner of the internet, and they all have varying degrees of financial firepower, scale, and et cetera, et cetera. What would doubling or tripling transportation costs do to them? Well, the ones with the thinnest margins will be vaporized, and the ones that have the biggest system in place that probably have products across multiple niches or industries, or maybe have products that have high margin that can then carry the water for the products that have lower margin that are destroyed in their economies of unit economics by transportation. I mean, this is a good, interesting question. So what would that mean? Would it mean your market competitors of 100 people who used to get by and compete and look like they were, you know, a thing, going concern against you? Would it look like they would then that would shrink by half, or even like more than that? And then what does that mean for sales velocity and outcomes? Does it mean that markets would, rather than being fragmented, um, become more concentrated on a few bigger sellers that have deeper pockets to finance things? I don't know. That might be an interesting dynamic that we see happen in the near future.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I mean, and that almost speaks to me to say that it is good that you sort of frame this by saying there are different types of industry from the point of view of this lens, if you like. So fragmented, emerging, consolidating, declining, global,
Mhm.
and fragmented is what we're focused on. But what it sounds like you're saying, and I think that sounds like good logic to me, and that's what I would say, from not personal experience, but my understanding of business history is that indeed consolidation does often happen when the smaller players can't afford to keep playing, and the big players kind of
Mhm.
either buy them out or simply push them out of business. By the way,
Yeah.
Amazon itself is a great example of that, isn't it? That the internet, and e-commerce shopping is reasonably diverse and fragmented, but it's nothing like as fragmented as it used to be before the advent of eBay, Amazon, and
Mhm.
Walmart. I mean,
Mhm.
whatever percentage of e-commerce they take now between them, 60%, 65, 70%.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that within those platforms or within e-commerce in general, we might see a similar thing driven by, say, high transportation costs. I think
Mhm.
your thesis sounds solid to me. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are the other things that are striking you as these some reasons for fragmentation here?
Well, I think there's probably a whole line of podcast episodes we could do on this
I think
phrase,
so. Yeah.
diseconomies of scale. The
Mhm.
thoughts immediately spring to mind of when I've seen clients have that problem. And by that, Porter means you have worse economics the bigger you get. But that happens in growth waves or in plateau steps, if you will. So, and a clear example is, let's say there's e-commerce seller that's selling a good solid product. They've figured out how to source relatively well and uniquely with good margin, and they're selling it on Amazon, and they're making $2 million a year. And then they call Jason Miles and say, I want to set up on Shopify, and I heard Shopify is a big deal, and we want to sell direct to consumer. And by the time they start talking to Kyle and I and do consulting conversations with us, they've sold themselves on the idea. Like Shopify's. We're gonna. Imagine if we sell an extra $50,000 a month on direct to consumer on Shopify, and we'll have the lists and the data and on and on. And so they've sold themselves into that. And then the reality is, frequently when we start to work through that with them, we say, well, you're going to need photography. Okay, photography, we'll get that. Well, you're going to need somebody to run this website beautifully, so you need a graphic artist. Oh, okay, we'll get that. Well, you're going to need somebody to get traffic to this website, so you're going to need to pay for that. Okay, we'll pay for that. Then you're going to need the legal and brand related assets that you make sure you own those if you haven't done that. So that's lawyer time and trademark stuff, and the list of ongoing expenses start to really pile, and people are left with the question, as sort of the valley of despair moments of what in the world have we gotten ourselves into. We were humming along with, good sales and good net profit on Amazon, and then we tried to scale to something higher, and we hit this horrible diseconomy where now we're blowing all this money on Shopify. That scenario is so common, and we work through that pain with people, and it is a valley of despair, because then of course they turn a corner, and what happens is they start to see traction greater than the expense. And they're like, okay, we're breaking even on Shopify. Okay, now our first goal on Shopify, maybe it's, our first goal is 10,000 a month, or in sales, or maybe it's 20,000 a month in sales. And then they hit that. And then what happens is that flywheel for the direct to consumer sales on Shopify begins to kick in, and they start to see the added value, and the thesis plays out in the direction they wanted, or it doesn't. And they say to themselves, we hate this. We can't sustain this. We realize we can't sell, motor oil direct to consumer on our own website, or, whatever it is. And they back away and say, this is more for a marketplace than it is for a standalone website. So anyway, so that scenario by itself is very fascinating to me. And I think this list provides a lot of grist for the mill in terms of ideas and issues for how e-commerce sellers can find themselves in traps.
Yeah, diseconomies of scale is interesting, because the question is whether that's just going to get worse the bigger you get, or whether it's in phases, as you implied. I mean, okay, changing sales channel, and I would argue business model, direct to consumer business model, I think works in different ways, doesn't it? So it's the cost of acquiring consumer versus the long-term customer value, and how long is long-term, and how do you cash flow that, versus the more brutal but more direct and simpler business model of marketplace selling, right? So that's one thing. So business models differ, but I wonder whether it's also a question of going through certain phases. So I know people who sold a business for 7 figures, where they had no VAs, no employees, nothing, and they did $400, $1,000 a year, maybe pre-tax profits, EBITDA, SDE. And if they were going to grow to the next level, they would have had to put some employees in there, maybe put a third-party logistics warehouse, or even own their own. And then I would have expected their percentage EBITDA to be simply lower, but it would have been a smaller percentage of a bigger figure. So, I wonder whether that goes in waves. What's your experience of that?
Well, I think it is an ROI questions for, there's plateaus. I think it's steps along the growth curve. And if you're, kind of become a big deal on Amazon, and you've kind of felt like, okay, I've cornered the my little subcategory on Amazon, I know what I'm doing. Then the question is, how do you invest in unlocking new sales channels? And therefore, this is why the e-commerce space is so fragmented, is because what you immediately realize is, oh, there was someone else crushing it on Google and direct to consumer on their own website, and I didn't know anything about them because I was focused on Amazon. Or somebody else is on Walmart.com already, or someone else is on eBay doing this well in a different way. And what you come to realize is that those little fragmented markets, you have to go and invade someone else's territory and say to yourself, okay, can I be a competitive threat to them on Walmart and do this well? And that will cost me time and money and staffing, and the systems process stuff. So I think those are hard challenges, but so common for each of us as e-commerce sellers to have to work through that.
Absolutely. The one that strikes me today, which even a few days ago, I listened to a podcast by a guy called Steve Larson, who runs, I think it's called Sales Funnel Radio, just to credit him with this. And he did a little breakdown of 4 different business models and comparing the gross profit, the overall profit, the the sellability of the company, and sort of comparing things. And it's really fascinating when you start to put together business models into one business, how the hybrid works. So he talks about e-commerce. He said, okay, the profit margin is pretty low. You said, oh yeah, the other thing's revenue, so sales price per unit. So sales generally $20 to $50 for most e-commerce type products. That ties in with my experience overwhelmingly. Yes, there'll be some exceptions. Info product, and they have a pretty low margin. The overall operating margin of the business isn't great, but you can sell them for, if it's direct to consumer site at the current stage, he said about 8 times EBITDA. Maybe it's even more at the moment. You can even sell an Amazon focused business that's fairly small for 5 times EBITDA if it's the right one. So, okay,
Mhm.
so the exit value is good, right? The info product space, you can sell, your famous, almost a cliche that you can sell a course for $500. It's very profitable in the gross margins, amazing because there's near zero marginal cost with digital products, which you've talked about extensively and rightly so. The overall profitability of the business is great, but can you sell it? Seriously hard to sell. Because you kind of probably
Yeah.
built a brand around one person, and that's really hard to sell. And then SaaS is
Mhm.
interesting because it's incredibly, it can be very expensive to run. The barriers to entry are pretty nasty, but the profit per added customer is pretty good because you add a bit of service base, and you can sell them from incredible multiple, like 8x revenue, which is crazy. And then there was one other business model that I don't know. Oh yes, coaching and
Yeah.
consulting, which again, has good profitability, pretty unsellable. So it's very, very interesting to me how that ties in with this fragmentation
Mhm.
piece and exit barriers, because I think, I don't know what your thoughts are, but I don't know how this feeds in, but Porter's exit barriers thing, it makes me think that actually
Mhm.
that might be part of why people are coming in, because the smarter players know that they can build a business that's very sellable, even if it's not
Mhm.
incredibly profitable in the meantime. What are your thoughts
Yeah.
on this stuff?
Of course, that's totally what's happening. And so what you get is this system that we all have watched, which is, somebody comes into the e-commerce space and 3 years later they declared themselves as the guru that conquered all of industry, and they're now expert. They've sold their business for $10 million or $20 million, and therefore they have the claim to fame. And then they started coaching consulting business, and that's just so like cliche at this point. Is like, there's so many gurus who you look at and they're like, how long have you been in e-commerce? Oh, 18 months. But I had a successful business, and then I sold it, and I learned so many lessons. You're like, yes, you did. I've been doing this for almost 15 years now, which is, I mean, it is what it is. It's, you see things come and go, but the reason in their mind they've done all that is because the velocity at which they can start, scale, and exit a business. So to your point, the exit ability of e-commerce operations is quite elegant and quite profound, and it leaves people with sometimes wonderful, successful outcomes, even for what might be considered marginal businesses, or businesses that don't have a lot of long-term value. I think that's fascinating dynamic of what's happening. So yeah, I hadn't thought of that either, but it is actually a very, very meaningful attribution to the e-commerce industry that we're seeing play out. And who can fault people and who can criticize them if you've come into a space and you've scaled something to millions of dollars of revenue and sold it successfully, and you did all that in 18 months or 2 years, then we probably do want to learn things from you, and you probably do know what you're doing. You probably do have awesome lessons to teach everyone, and
Yeah,
so
damn
it's
them.
a funny
These
dynamic, isn't
Johnny
it?
come latelys. Well, we've been there for 15 years. Um,
It's-
One other thing that struck me that
yeah,
he said, which struck me with you as an example in my mind, and be interested in your take on this. He said that people often will combine the info product thing where you get a very high profit margin, but it's very unsellable, with a SaaS, which
mhm,
is a software as a service business, which is hard to get into,
yeah,
or acquire, expensive to acquire sometimes, but can be very profitable and extremely sellable. So I know that you guys are getting with OmniRocket, you broadened your remit. You've now got a software as a service business as part of the sort of
yeah,
aligned with your information
mhm,
marketing kind of an empire that you and Kyle are building. So
yeah.
what's your strategic thinking behind this?
Well, right. Everything he just described is the track that we're on, and that you just outlined there. It sounds like a wonderful podcast. I need to listen to it. Well, Kyle and I were e-commerce operators that started doing, well, in my case, writing books, which has its own dynamics, and then um, education. Basically, you know, one-on-one coaching, and then what we realized in 2000, hmm, I guess it was maybe 2020, was there was software as a service tools that do have those very, very interesting dynamics. So in my newsletter, in the footer of it, for the last year and a half, I've told people the business we're building to serve you, and I lay out my business model. It is made up of four component parts: the software as a service tools, which are OmniRocket Pro, the sourcing tool Danny Stock originally created, was Legendary Sourcing, and now OmniRocket sourcing tool. That SaaS model has the dynamics you described. One of the dynamics of that industry or model is, of course, that there's ready money to be invested from Silicon Valley in such enterprises. But we've woven that together with our one-on-one coaching, which is obviously not sellable as an exit, but it's high margin, and we like doing it. And then we have educational events based on my writing and authorship, but also on these large events. We just did, for example, the e-commerce Power Summit for 2022, and had 500 people who registered for that. And that education track has its own dynamics. And then what the fourth component of our business model is done for you services, where we basically built the dream team of operators that we then allow our clients to tap into. So we have graphic art and Shopify site dev people, and funnel builders, and people who used to work at Facebook who now work for us to do Facebook advertising, and on and on and on. So we built this dream team that we use for our own business, but we sort of shop them out to other clients. So those done for you services are the fourth part of our business model. So all of these swirl together to make an interesting business for us that we think is valuable and is growing in value, both on real net profit terms, but also on growth and the ability to get investor income, investor money, and also the ability to exit someday. So
By the
yeah,
way,
all of these fragmented bits are what we're working through all the time. Yeah.
excellent. By the way, if that had been my intention, this is the most organic pitch ever for somebody in a podcast. But that was absolutely not my intention, nor it was yours. It just struck
No,
me that
not at
actually,
all.
this is, you are, watching, as a business coach of mine said years ago. He was a smart guy, but he said, look, okay, by all means, follow what smart people say, but above all, observe what they do. And I think
Yeah.
what you do and what you say match very well. You have great integrity, as I'd expect of you, but it's very interesting to look at that, because actually, I suppose it gives us a bigger picture that e-commerce sits within very closely related industries, and
Mhm.
much of which is subject to this fragmentation thing, right? Because in
Yeah.
the end, if you're going to sell somebody a course or coaching, as we both do, for a particular thing, there's a very fragmented need, which is very,
Mhm.
very specific. Amazon private label training, I mean, like, that's seriously specific, right? That's not
Yeah.
generic business coaching. So um, this is very interesting stuff. I mean, what else have we got here? Newness. You're an American. Tell me about newness. American marketing has somehow made newness a fetish for the last 100+ years. I think more than anywhere in the world, that strikes me. Why is newness part of this fragmentation thing?
It's because what they said in the Iron Giant cartoon. Did you ever watch that? It's all about planned obsolescence. All the old toasters and the old cars all sit around and they're so sad in the cartoon because the people who were smart and built all these things created planned obsolescence. And it is an interesting dynamic, isn't it, for product development, that it's always the new thing that catches people attention. And there's such a confluence right now of influencers. For example, the TikTok crowd that comes up, or the Instagram crowd that comes up, and they're hip and young and have huge social currency and status. And what do they want to do? Well, they don't want to do what their parents were doing, and they don't want to wear what their parents were wearing. And it's all about the new thing. The British invasion in the 60s for the Beatles and all that created a culture in which we were always looking for the new thing. Many times it comes from Britain. I mean, there's tons of cultural influence from
It's very
Europe and,
true.
and that kind of thing. But there's always this churn, and it bleeds right into salesmanship and product pitching, and it's almost organic. You see the whoever's Kardashians or whatever, and what they happen to be wearing in terms of a necklace or a bracelet or shoes or something like that, which was, I guess, strategically planned on their part, but such a minor component of their lifestyle brand. And yet whole industries can be shifted or created because of this amazing new, necklace or bracelet or shoes or whatever it is. And e-commerce folks are quick to facilitate those, the sales from it, and find, those trends. And that trend spotting thing is, well, there's whole universities that have trend analysts and market forecasters in fashion. My daughter went through University of Hawaii's fashion merchandising track for her undergraduate degree, and they're all taught how to do this stuff, how to spot trends, how to make lookbooks and trend books and things like that, so that people know what's coming, who's the coolest person doing the coolest thing, and what does that mean for your niche or industry. And many industries that we operate in are so boring and slow compared to what I just described, but they're not impermeable. I mean, there is influence in even the slowest industry towards what is the new thing and why is it better than the old thing, and what are the dynamics by which it can be changed. So much of that is written about in my favorite book, Growing a Business by Paul Hawken, where he talks about strategies for creating newness in product development. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's just a common part of what happens on e-commerce. The weird part about it in today's marketplace is the speed at which a new thing can go from zero to just millions or just huge volume. And when I was a kid, we'd hear about a new bubble gum or a new comic book character, or a new like whatever, like sports celebrity or something like that. And those things would come along so slowly. But in today's industries, with social media fueling e-commerce, you get this incredible velocity, and things can pop up. And of course, those things can be engineered as well, where your thing maybe isn't cool, maybe isn't really new, maybe isn't that dynamically interesting. And yet, with the right influencer working with you to the right community of their buyers, it can be perceived as the new thing for them. And your sales velocity can take off. So, all of these things, you just sit back and watch, and you're like, wow, such an amazing industry we're a part of, and we're always constantly surprised by these things, and yet history rhymes, and you see these things over and over.
Wow, I'm glad I asked you that question. That's some profound things in that. Planned obsolescence kind of sounds really obvious as soon as you say it. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, iPhone creates the iPhone 10, the iPhone
Yeah.
12, the iPhone 25, when I'm an old
It's-
man, the iPhone 50, if they're still around. By the way, they may
yeah,
not be, but that's a different question. But
yeah,
yeah, very interesting. But also, what struck me is within myself, and I'm not, am I a typical? I buy a lot of stuff on Amazon, so am I a typical? I'm just a particular type of consumer. So part of me, and you were talking about the identity link with newness, which is very interesting because teenagers have always wanted to buy new stuff. And you're right there, the Britain has exported new stuff. I think actually TV and pop industry accounts for about 10% of GDP here. It's huge. I kind of look down my nose at it because my background's people, playing music that's at least 200 years old, so that for me is established. That's quality music that stood the test of time. This is not typical of your average consumer, and I recognize this. But also, I identify myself very proudly with, if it's old, it's good. It's just a little bit hipster. I've got one of one of the trends you might see is people like buying, I don't know, vinyl records or old stuff or things to look after old
yeah,
stuff. I don't know,
yeah.
brushes for ancient clothes. So there's a sort of, there's newness, and then there's kind of a new take on oldness, which sells really well. I suppose
Yeah,
hipsterdom is, if that means anything, is
yeah,
that. And then there's just old, but actually via new media. So I would buy, downloads of very old symphonies played by dead people, but
mhm,
via Spotify or Apple Music, for example. You don't have to pay on
yeah,
Spotify. So
yeah,
it's interesting, that relationship between newness and traditionalism and
yeah,
identity. There's a whole bunch of stuff that, wow, there's each one of these could be a podcast in themselves, right? There's a load going
totally.
on here.
An example of that that's funny to me to behold, which is interesting, is my grandmother had this room in the front of her house, and she called it her sunroom, and she grew African violets there. And she's in her 70s, 80s, whatever, when I'm a kid, and that was just what she did. So I learned to love houseplants, from her. And I'm 51, and I'm not, I'm kind of a boring old guy too, but I like my houseplants. So I was just shocked to see that the like millennials on Instagram and TikTok, there's a whole industry of 19-year-old girls who are incredibly into houseplants. They make these amazing, Instagram reels and TikTok videos all about their houseplants. And these people in far off places like the Philippines have these huge YouTube channels where all they do is talk about their plants that are common to them, but people around the world are fascinated because they're house plants or unique plants, orchids and kokodama and all these things that are just global little interesting things that have been around for centuries, that somehow have become new again. And the YouTube video channels and TikTok and social media and Instagram have blown them up to new heights. And if you're a plant salesman, you're thinking, what in the world has happened? Our industry has been recatalyzed by the what's old is new again phenomenon. And
Yeah,
it's just
old wine in
interesting to
new
watch.
bottles is the phrase that springs to mind, and I guess that's the
Really.
marketer's dream. I think all people who go to a consultant or coach are just secretly hoping that you can just pour the old wine of their existing product into the new bottle of your magical marketing hacks, and
Mm.
hey presto, lots of profit flows out. Sometimes that can be done, I guess. I mean, certainly the broader branding strategy, you can certainly do that. I think a lot of it's organic, right? The people making their TikTok videos probably hoping to get famous. Some of them do by chance. A lot of them just love houseplants and like videos, I suppose.
Yeah.
The other thing
Yeah.
that strikes me, again, coming back to diverse market needs, which is one of the the forces that Porter identified as leading to fragmented markets. This is such a rich theme. I'm so glad you brought this up. That diverse market needs, but buyers are willing to pay a premium for very special varieties. Um, that's super important for sort of
Yeah.
again the riches and the niches idea, right?
Right.
What's your experience of that, either as a seller yourself or what, with your clients?
Well, it's incredibly relevant to today's e-commerce dynamics. I mean, I mentioned Etsy, I think, when I was doing this initial read through of the 12 forces. But, you go on many, many e-commerce platforms now, and what you'll realize is there's a global use case for such interesting small variants or versions or tweaks or changes. Just for an example, many physical goods sellers who sell something that's to some degree a commodity will put it in a package with like six things, like, oh, it's six light bulbs or it's six whatever. But there's actually a massive community of people who are maybe restaurateurs or school administrators or people who need, the 400 pack, not the six pack. They want the 400 pack. That unique need and their willingness to pay a premium for someone who said to themselves, oh, I'm going to actually sell this just for the fire departments of America, or I'm just going to set this up so that it works for teachers, really good, or for coaches of sports teams. Those little tiny, to your point, riches in the niches. If maybe they changed that word to make it work that way. I don't know, riches in the niches. When you start to go down that track, you realize there's almost an infinite set of unique customers that have been globalized on the marketplaces, and therefore almost an infinite number of opportunities for people to become differentiated in service of those customer communities. And the old classic statement is from in the Long Tail by Chris Anderson. His commentary on this, which is a fantastic book to read about this, by the way. His commentary is that in the olden days, pre-internet, which, Michael, you and I remember, you remember London before the internet, probably, and I remember my hometown, little, California town. You couldn't have a store, for example, for uh, pen aficionados, the inkwell type pens. Now, maybe in London, of course, you did have that, but in little towns in America, you couldn't. There weren't enough people who cared, you know? You couldn't have, for example, to go back to our prior comments about plants, you couldn't have a thriving plant stop shop. You would have a florist who delivered flowers and also had a few plants. But the roll up of these marketplaces have allowed these differentiators to really build incredible businesses on the back of this super delineated service for these diverse needs, diverse communities, and I think it won't stop. Especially because you'll what you realize, of course, is there's huge markets that are not even on the internet yet. And our charity serves in Zambia, and Zambian, internet technology, connectivity, the devices themselves, whether you have a phone that's able to get you on the internet or computers, there are just massive swaths of people who are just behind on that stuff. But guess what they're going to do when they get on the internet? they're going to start looking for houseplants. They're going to start looking for, ink pens and their whatever their funny hobby is. And we're going to be blessed by them. And we'll have new things they sell into the world that were unique. And so I think that's never going to stop. And I think that's one reason the internet e-commerce space will always be fractured and fragmented. To Michael Porter's point here in this book. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say, by the way, I didn't grow up in London. I grew up in a smallish town called Gloucester, which has got, it was in the Domesday Book because that's where it started. So it's got good history, typically British, but about 100,000 people. So it was
Did
similar.
they
You
have
wouldn't
a
have found.
store for ink pens and
They
inkwells?
did not have a store for, well, they might have done actually, but they didn't have really, specialist stores
Good.
like, ink only green ink or something like that. Whereas
Yeah.
in London or New York, even back in the day, you could probably find that stuff, right? But,
Yeah.
or LA or somewhere. But to your point, I mean, I think almost infinite set of unique customers you could serve. I mean, that thing of like, there are always communities that will pay a premium for things. I mean, if you've got a pretty commodity product, but you can bundle it up with other things that are less of a commodity, or you can just, even if it's selling quite well. We had a guy in the mastermind the other day. We just gave him the most simplistic advice in the world, but he went, oh yeah, it was news to him. So we'll see how the numbers look next meeting. But we basically said, okay, so you're selling a 6-pack of this. Why don't you sell an entire case, which apparently Amazon can let you fulfill now. So you send in a shipping carton of whatever it is, 24, 48 units, whatever it is. And why don't you offer it? I said, why don't you offer a discount for, 10 cases, 20 cases, 50? Because if you're buying for a hotel chain, maybe they're going to get through, 1,000 units of this X widget that I must make sure I don't name for
Yeah.
in the next month, and maybe they'll buy 6 months worth. So you might
Yeah.
shift, 50 cases instead of 3 individual units. So there's profound
Yeah.
money to be made by simply thinking this stuff through
Yeah.
and just doing the blindingly obvious, but it's only obvious once you've done it, right? And this is a very simple play. I mean, like, a lot of people have thought of this, but to be more nuanced, as you said, if you're catering to schools that have slightly different needs,
Yeah.
to a community center, which is a slightly different need, to a hospital, which is different from commercial kitchens, any
Yeah.
one of which could buy hundreds of units at a time. I think even in on itself, that is a huge opportunity.
Yeah, totally right. It just reminds me what you just described of one of our clients we work with who went through that scenario I mentioned earlier, where wonderful on Amazon, and then trying to sell on Shopify was just a real slog, and went through the valley of despair and the challenges. Well, one of the things that was very interesting as that seller came out of that valley of despair on direct to consumer sales on Shopify was, in his case, restaurants found him on direct to consumer website he had made because of his investment in SEO and Google ads and such. And the pallets started going out the warehouse. It's like, not can I buy this by the case, it's can I buy this by the pallet. And then what he realized, of course, was they would have never ever done that through the Amazon direct selling system. They would only do that if they found him through his own website. And so,
Mm.
all this challenge of the investment in the website felt like, misery. And it was like, will
Yeah.
this work? But then it's like, well, there's an audience out there that will absolutely make it work with you or for you if you
Mm.
find them. And that was unlocked in that scenario. Very fascinating to watch. And those purchase orders for big, in at scale buyers, or it's a whole different game.
And
And
what's interesting is that they put a website up with one business model in mind,
yeah,
business to consumer, B2C or
yeah,
D2C, via a different model than the marketplace. And if you run that model at a tiny scale, it's absolutely broken because, as you said, all the costs of the upfront costs and then your ongoing costs of graphic designers and photographers and everything else are going to crush you. Whereas what they actually stumbled across was a B2C, B2B opportunity, which suddenly
hmm
changed everything. And I guess sometimes you have to put stuff out there before you
yeah,
stumble across opportunity, right? That's the
yeah.
thing you
The
can't
fog of
plan for.
war, if you will. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah. So
you don't
fascinating.
know. I mean, you don't
Yes.
know how your offer is matching to the market, and you have to stumble your way through these things sometimes. And the reality is, sometimes it takes you 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, 24 months to figure out who am I missing here, and
Yeah.
or who am I finding, and am I serving them in the way that they want to be served? And that is such simple phrasing that's obvious when you say it. Like, of course. you
Yeah.
know,
Retrospect
fulfill a
is
need, but
always
like I
obvious,
don't
isn't it?
know the need, and I don't know what they want. I don't know who they are, but I think I want to serve them, and those are lessons that are hard learned. Yeah, yeah,
I guess the only thing I would say is you could short circuit the learning process by looking at the type of product and how you'd use it in what context, and
yeah.
just thinking through. Okay, people tend to buy, and the other one is taking the hint from the data. What are other? Like I used to sell stuff that people would
Mhm,
habitually buy 50 of, and if I'd
mhm.
taken it at the next step, was going to be just get an email list, just and cold email them, and have a fairly simple direct to consumer site. I wasn't even going to try and sell on that because it was an obvious play because the data told me that. But the other thing is, if I'd thought about it, which I hadn't, after a while, you think, oh yeah, people tend to buy these in 50s and hundreds because it's the nature of the beast. They're sold to institutions. So I guess one could at least take a stab at that as a thesis and try and put some kind of business to business call out on a site if the product lends
Yeah,
itself to that.
yeah,
Probably not Jimmy Choo's shoes equivalents or something like that.
mhm, yeah.
So, listen, fascinating stuff that I just want to mention to people once again. We talked a lot about this in generalizations and fascinating discussion, I think, but we are going to be talking about 5 approaches to how to overcome fragmentation, which is really important. So, practical
Mhm.
and doable stuff. We can talk about that in our next episode. If you're still up for that, Jason, I certainly am. Could you just run through again, just summarize those 12 reasons for fragmentation of a market as put out there by Michael Porter?
Sure. Yeah. And I am excited about that conversation about the 5 ways to overcome the fragmented market. And again, I mean, if you're enjoying this conversation, go get a copy of Michael Porter's competitive strategy book, pour through that, and then, we'll have these reflections together here. So, yeah, let me recap the 12 reasons industries get fragmented, and we'll wrap up here. The first one is low overall entry barriers. The second one is the absence of economies of scale. The third one is high transportation costs. The fourth one is high inventory costs or erratic sales. The fifth one is no advantage of size when dealing with buyers or suppliers. The sixth one is diseconomies of scale. Things become more expensive as you get bigger. The seventh one is diverse market needs, or the desire on the customer side for differentiation. The eighth one is high product differentiation. The ninth one is exit barriers, or problematic ways to get out of the market. The 10th one is local regulation. The 11th is government prohibition or concentration in industries. And the 12th one is newness that emerges in markets. So there you have it, man. I think this is a wonderful line of thinking for all of us who are really trying to brainstorm how best to position our products and our offers. And it's fun to be able to go through the list with you. So, as always, it's an honor. Want to go ahead
Yeah.
and wrap it up for us here?
Absolutely, yeah. It's been great fun. And I think this bigger picture thinking really comes into its own when you have to make decisions about where you're going next with your business, and or the marketplace shifts greatly and forces you into decision making mode, which is not necessarily something any of us particularly look for or want. But I think that things are shifting very rapidly at the moment, and I think going to continue to. So this ability to do bigger picture thinking is going to be really important, I think. Talking of which, I want to call out first OmniRocket. You mentioned that before. We've talked in quite a lot of detail about your strategy. www.omnirocket.com. What things can you offer there immediately if people are interested in working with you more, Jason, or indeed Tyler?
Sure. Yeah, it's the hub for all of our services. So we do one-on-one consulting by application only. You can certainly, connect with us that way. We always do a free conversation with everyone who applies, just to understand whether we're a good fit for you and you're a good fit for us, and whether it's an appropriate service. There's also obviously our software tools available there, and those are designed for Amazon sellers. There's a suite of tools there that are being updated, refined, worked on all the time. They're low cost. The full suite is just 29 bucks. And then we have links to our educational resources, our books and our events and that kind of thing. So all of that's available on omnirocket.com. You're muted.
I guess I ought to give myself a shout out. It just sounds a bit lame. AmazingFBA.com if you want to do some one-to-one work, particularly if you're UK based or Europe. We are increasingly, I think, in a somewhat different situation to America, thanks to the geopolitical ramifications of what's going on. And we've got the mastermind for UK-based and European-based sellers as well. So just go to amazingfba.com. That's our kind of hub. Last thing to say is happy to report that our downloads are up quite a bit, I think, year on year. I've been looking at the stats recently, and that's great. So thank you so much for following and supporting us. If you haven't done so yet, please go to Spotify and follow the show and rate it if you can. It's a rating out of 5 stars. If you're on Apple, same thing. I think they call it follow now. So they're leading, Spotify's leading the language, which is interesting. So Apple Podcasts is certainly aware of Spotify, and they've changed the language to follow, I think, from subscribe, but whichever it is, follow or subscribe. And then you can rate us there as well. Rating 1 to 5 stars. You can even leave a review on Apple Podcasts if you can, and if you're liking the show, take 30 seconds and give us the love, because it gives us the encouragement. We do look at what you write, we do notice what you're doing, and it gives us encouragement to keep going with this stuff. So thank you very much in advance for doing that for us.
Great conversation, man. Really look forward to the next one as well, and it's always an honor.
Me too. Yeah, great fun. Thank you so much for your thoughts.
All right, friends, that's the wrap on the podcast. Those of you who are listening with us, really appreciate it for the live audience, and we'll end it here. But I'm really looking forward to this. We might have to break apart Michael Porter's book even further and go into
I think so.
the other sections. It's such good stuff. So
yeah, I agree. This is rich, a rich scene we're mining here. So yeah, absolutely, I'm into that. Let's do that.
Sounds great. All right, buddy. We'll end it there. Bye, guys.